All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out to the Laravel Austin Meetup. Got a couple of great presentations today. Just going to talk real quick about, first off, we meet every second Tuesday right here. So there's plenty of space, so if you want to invite your friends, it's more than welcome. I think we're a pretty welcoming bunch here. So. Yeah, you can check us out, LaravelAustin.com or meetup.com/Laravel-Austin. And I'm going to start off with, last month I actually went to the Laravel conference, which was up in New York. And it actually was probably maybe only about 25 to 30% Laravel specific. And the rest of it was a lot of like best practices and some programming methodologies and things like that. And it was at a really nice place, the Scholastic Auditorium. It was very, very, very fun. Got to hang out with a lot of people and a lot of really cool people. So we're just going to go out. What's that?
The guy in the front there looks like Taylor, the bald dude.
Oh yeah. And I was sitting over this way somewhere. That wasn't my picture. I stole it from somebody. So a couple of things that they introduced, which kind of exciting. The first was Homestead, and I don't know if anybody's used VMs, Vagrant, anything like that. It's very easy to get set up, and I mean it's been getting easier because I remember when I first started trying to do a Vagrant setup, trying to get the whole server working, and it was just a mess. But then one of the big Laravel guys, Chris Fidao, created this Vapro Bash thing, which was just a script that you could run, and it did a lot of the stuff. Well, now Taylor came out with this thing called Homestead, which there's still a little bit of a learning curve involved. You have to get a virtual box installed or whatever kind of virtualization software. Then you install the Vagrant box, which is the Laravel Homestead box, which is basically just a prepackaged Ubuntu Linux system. And I think it tells you what it has already provisioned for you. So it's Ubuntu 14.4, PHP 5.5, Nginx, MySQL, Postgres, has all the Node stuff in it, Redis, Memcache, Beanstalk, Laravel Envoy, which I've never used for anything, and then Fabric and HipChat extension. I've never used that either. It's really not that difficult to get set up if you just kind of follow along with the steps, and you can have a fully running server, Ubuntu server running on your machine virtually, and it makes it really easy to have the same environment across multiple platforms. I mean, because it'll run on anything that you develop on. So that was really handy. But the thing is, it really ties into the second one too, which is Forge, which is a way to create and manage your development servers from cloud servers. They include DigitalOcean, let's see what it says, DigitalOcean, Rackspace, Amazon, Linode. And I will just kind of show you a quick bit about how it works here. Oh, of course.
Security.
Yes. Fancy two-factor authentication.
Nobody look.
That'll be gone in 2 seconds. So yeah, so if you wanted to create, I've got Linode and DigitalOcean set up here. So if you wanted to, if you had a DigitalOcean account or Linode account or whatever kind of cloud server that you wanted to provision, and you don't want to have to go through all the command line stuff that you normally do or have to compile your shell scripts or that kind of thing, this takes care of all of that for you. And it's super simple and kind of crazy, but it provisions with the same specs as Homestead, so that if you're developing using the Homestead virtual machine, it's going to be essentially the exact same as whatever you provision on your cloud server. So it's very nice, and it's super easy to get set up. I mean, you have to add in some API keys, and then you can do some management. One of the things that I thought was great was the security certificates. Trying to install a security SSL onto a server, it sometimes can be a bit of a pain. It took me maybe 20 minutes from having nothing to getting a free SSL thing from, I think it's freeSSL.org or something like that, and installing it. So it was like a total of 20 minutes, which was pretty nice, and was able to do it all through the interface here. So it's a pretty nifty little thing. It's $10 a month just for this service, and he's adding in a bunch of other things. Let's see if it shows it. I haven't really messed with it, but I know you can set up a pre-configured WordPress. I think there's a craft CMS. I think there's some other stuff too that you can set up pre-configured automatically just right through here. So, yeah. That's nice. The last thing, the big thing they talked about as far as programming stuff that was kind of a buzzword. I mean, there were 3 specific talks about commands and command bus, and a couple other ones that touched on it quite a bit. And it seems to be everybody's talking about, at least in the Laravel community, about commands and command buses, which is really just more of an abstraction, more of a way to get out of procedural code and move some of the event stuff, which Wes is going to talk about, into different commands, and that way you can write your code that does something and then write the events that are completely separate from it, and then just tie those events into the code, so you're not actually having to mess with your original code, and all the solid principles. It follows that. I mean, it's nice. I haven't seen much use for me personally, just because we don't have like a full enterprise app, and I've not been working on any full like enterprise apps. So I'm pretty good with just repositories and service providers. So it is what it is. But on Laracasts, he has a really great overview of all the different things that you can do and how to set it up and how to get your command bus, and I think they're all free. So if you want to check that out, laracasts.com series, command and domain events. And Jeffrey Way, who runs this, is he's very good at what he does. So it's definitely something to check out.
It's pretty cool. I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah. No, he goes pretty in depth, and and they're all pretty short. So that's kind of the thing, is that it's something you can do. You can watch a couple like during your lunch break or something like that, and it's not going to eat up a whole bunch of your time. Let's see, just a couple of announcements. Got some gigs, which is kind of cool for Austin Laravel developers. So if any of y'all want some contract stuff, Ken over here is actually he's the top guy here. So if you're looking for some contract work, sounds like a really interesting thing, and I was just wanting to pass it on. I'm just way too busy to take on stuff. And then I got another email from this guy, Leaguecasts, another PHP Laravel thing. So this will all be up on the website, or it actually is up on the website already. So if you all want to check it out, y'all can get the information about that. So yeah. Some calendar stuff. This Thursday in 2 days is the Austin PHP Meetup, which is all PHP stuff. And they're actually going to be talking about the Falcon framework and Aura. Falcon is it actually compiles the PHP into C. Okay. And then Aura is
Standalone library.
just standalone, a bunch of standalone libraries. which the only difference between Aura and Laravel is that he doesn't actually give you a single thing to put them together, and Taylor does. But whatever. And if you ever follow there's the PHP drama, the guy who created Aura has a bit of a beef. I don't know, it's pretty lighthearted, I guess, but has a bit of a beef with Taylor, who created Laravel, because of facades and things like that. It's entertaining if you like that kind of thing. So anyways, so we'll be talking about both of those. And that happens every second Thursday of the month. So it's usually the 2 days after this meetup, sometimes the Thursday before, depending on how many weeks. A couple other things, some conferences, if y'all are interested in some PHP stuff. Northeast PHP up in Boston. PHP World, which is a new one. They run PHP Tech, which is normally in Chicago. And this is a new conference, more focusing on the specific communities within the PHP community instead of the broader PHP. Actually got, I think you got an email too from the guy who, one of the organizers, looking for talks. So if anybody has a talk you want to give about Laravel or WordPress, whatever, that's it, world.phparch.com, call for papers. I actually submitted one, so we'll see if that happens. It looks to be like a pretty cool little thing, because it's going to be, I think it talked about like Drupal and Joomla and WordPress, but then also like Laravel and Symfony and stuff like that. So it should be pretty interesting. ZenCon, which is the big PHP Mac Daddy thing, happening in October. And at the end of the month, I mean, right now it's really cheap. I mean, by the end of on the day of tickets, like $1,500. So if you wanted to go out to Santa Clara, next Laravel meetup, it's on the 8th of July. PHP on the 10th, 2 days after. I think that's it. All right, cool. Next up, we'll have Wes.
All right.
I'll let Wes handle it.
All right.
So, bear with me. I wrote this today, so. Who here is familiar with event-driven architecture? Has everyone pretty much used it more or less? I mean, I know the observer pattern itself, but I mean, using it within a framework. Yeah? No? Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of what the actual observer pattern is. So it starts out with, it's commonly known as the publish subscribe pattern. It's basically a way of setting a relationship between listeners and subscribers. And basically what happens is when you fire an event, your application is already ready to make something happen, essentially. So it's a behavioral design pattern which defines a one-to-many relationship between objects such that when an object changes its state, all dependent objects are notified and updated automatically. So when you have, let's say, a controller, for instance, and when you're going through the controller, and let's say it's a sign up. A user comes in and signs up, and then you subsequently have to say, I want to send an email, I need to subscribe to our newsletter, I need to do this and this and this and this, and your controller's starting to get real bulky and real nasty really fast. And that's not really what you want. You don't want to have too much logic in a controller. You want to keep it kind of separated. And I'll go into that further, but so, like I said, all subsequent objects are the observers and the subscribers. The observers are notified whenever the state of the subject changes, so they may react accordingly. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the actual pattern itself. I mean, it's already implemented in Laravel, so it's kind of easy to just run through and just kind of leverage what's there. So in software, an event is simply an occurrence of a particular thing at a particular moment. For example, say you're creating an e-commerce website. An event can be interested in using whenever a user creates an account on your website. So what happens next? Well, you're probably going to want to send the user an email, newsletter, sign up for a newsletter, probably a few more things depending on how your site is architected, correct? So by defining the event, in this case, let's call it user create. And that's kind of the schema that Laravel uses this for. You can do user create camel case, or however you want to name it within the system itself, but just to follow the system events and the model events, just gonna kind of, what's that called? Periods in between, just whatever. So you can set all the tasks in motion when somebody signs up. It's a really good way to architect your application so that your controls are lean, and that what you're trying to do is all separated through like solid methodology. So separation of concerns, right? Because you don't want too much stuff in the controllers. It's going to get nasty, and we'll go over that some more in a second. So at this point, probably wondering why you want to use events. But first, you need to understand the basic structure, how events work, and why you want to use them. But with the event-based architecture, it's easy to maintain separation of concerns. I'm gonna get ahead of myself. I like to start with the next slide, the previous one. When an event is triggered, it does not know anything about what will happen as a consequence of firing said event. With this separation in place, you can have your events and listeners in two distinct places. So it's really nice because your controller doesn't need to know that you need to send an email to a user when it signs up. It just needs to serve the page for you, essentially, right? So you want those concerns completely abstracted out. Especially if you're building larger applications, you get to a point where your controller, I mean, I'm sure with older frameworks, for instance, I'm sure when we all started out, we had these just massive controllers. They just look nasty, they're filthy, you get to a point where they're almost unmaintainable, because there's so many revisions that go through where you get to a point, you just look at it and just like, and you start having those nasty comments where you're like, sorry, dude. You know what I mean? Feel bad for the next developer who uses this. So I'm going to kind of go through just kind of a code example of what I was saying earlier. So I mean, like, let's say for instance, you just need to create a user, right? These are the actions that you'd probably take place, et cetera, et cetera. So here's like just some pseudocode, comments of logic in there. So we don't want that in our controller. With lean controllers, it can get messy. So this is an example of an actual event firing in Laravel. This is the syntax used. So let's say we created the user, and now we created the user, we obviously need to call the events. I can't see. Got it? Yep. Okay, so yeah, so we're gonna do a user create method, and that's gonna be the actual event that we set up when we actually set the listener. So I'll show you that here in a minute. But so now we want to actually that uses. I'm sorry. The second parameter we're going to pass in is user. So we need to know when we actually call the event, the listener needs to know what to pass through. So I'm going to send an email out. I'm going to subscribe someone to an actual newsletter. We need to know who the user is, right? You can't just assume. So we actually obviously have to pass that in. And so that's usually the second parameter used for it. But if you want to have multiple, you can apply multiple events or multiple namespaces and multiple variables. But you just define the first one as an array instead of a string. So, okay, so. Yeah, so once you realize the beauty of separating your application into smaller, more manageable chunks, you'll have a hard time staying away from event-based architecture. So the basic premise of event structure is you fire the event precisely when you want it to happen. So the listener will kick in. So like in the control I showed you before, you can do it directly. You want to do it directly after you create the user, right? You're not gonna want to send an email to a user you haven't created yet. So it needs to, it's PHP, right? It's not fully async. We're not threading, so we need to do it in order. so we need to do it directly after our events take place. So here's a basic example of firing an event. And you can name it whatever, like I was saying earlier, you can use the actual Laravel structure, user.create or so on and so forth. These are what the system events have, that's what they use. It's just an easy way, I mean, you don't want to sway from the structure of the actual framework too often. So then it just kind of gets messy, right? And we're all about cleanliness in our code, right? Go ahead, shake your heads. So, like I said, but the convention's up to you. You change it to do whatever you want. All right, so these are, like I was saying earlier, passing in parameters. So we had an event firing called user create, but what if we needed to pass user information from these methods? No problem. The second parameter, the second argument is the parameter for the user we want to pass through. And from there, we actually know that the user's email, the user, and the newsletter. We do everything subsequently after that. Crazy, right?
Can we go back a slide? Does the array, if you were passing multiple users, would it like cycle over all of them?
Well, you're basically just passing it through. So once you actually use a listener, if you want to set up as a service provider or a handler or just using a straight up closure itself, that's what you would use it for. So you pass that through, and you do whatever you need to. So if you need to iterate through them, you iterate through them.
Okay.
So
it's just always an array though, as the syntax of.
And you can pass as many as you want through there. It's not limited. And you can have, if you want to, as far as the first argument goes, if you want to fire multiple events with this one trigger, just you make that an array instead of a string. Easy enough. And then you pass in the strings to the array. Everyone clear on that?
You don't pass a mapper through that?
A what?
A mapper?
A mapper?
Yeah, instead of passing an array of individual object, let's say all of your things you want to fire off there, instead of creating multiple events, you can create a mapper of all the events you want to fire.
Like an array?
It's up to the listeners to define what they want to take. So they just get the entire array and they just pull out what they want.
Yeah.
You can have infinitely many listeners.
Yeah. You can do wildcards too. I can do user.star, and it would call everything on the user side, every event that we register.
Is there a way to delay the firing of it?
Yes, there's actually a queue. I didn't go over it on this system, but there's actually, or on this presentation, but there's an actual queue. You can actually set delays and so on and so forth. It's the third parameter in this. So you put 5, 10, just integer.
Oh, or like 15 hours or whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
All right, so now we're gonna go through the listeners. So listening to an event is a simple process as well. We're gonna go over some basic syntax, and we'll go over where some items could be placed, like where the actual files go, where do you want to put stuff, structure of application. Right? So in this sense, the listener itself is going to be a closure, right? And this, we actually pass the user in. So what we were using earlier, we want to pass user or users, we do with whatever we want. So let it be a model, call user email, set call MailChimp, whatever the hell you use, and we're good to go. Am I moving too fast? Any questions?
I have one question. Where do you where do you store these files for the event?
Okay, I'm going to show you that here in a minute. So when you actually call the event, when you fire them, you can put them anywhere in your application, right? As long as it's available to the framework, right? So I mean, controllers, models, etc.
And you can have multiple listeners for a single event.
Yes.
What serializes them?
What serializes them?
Yeah. How do you order them?
Well, I mean, you can set a priority for them. Yeah. That's actually, I'm sorry, that's the third argument. That's the priority. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. But there is queues as well. I didn't go over that one though. So. But you can also, if you're in an actual, say for instance you have a wildcard, for instance, you're calling all the user events itself, like that you call it the wildcard. You can actually do event firing to see which event is firing first, and then just structure it outward there. So if you have, say, user create, user update, and you wanted to do something specific for user create and something specific for user update, but you're calling them both for some reason, as an example. And you can have event firing is equal to, and let's say user create, and then specifically just an if statement and do specific things for that, and then have another one for the updating, and then you can do additional items for both of them. So we'll go over that here in a minute. So there it is, yeah. So this is another example. So you have multiple events associated with a user. When you create, another being update, we can easily register a wildcard listener, so we get basically an umbrella listener. And then we set a listener with a wildcard. And if we wanted to actually grab the specific event that's being fired, it's very easy. I mean, if y'all have seen the event, the model events as well, they pretty much document. They do a really good job of documenting, updating, updated, saving, saved, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the events themselves through the models, you can do multiple things while the events are being fired throughout the saving process or updating process and so on. All right, well, So I don't like my events to live in just a file, like randomly sitting there. But you can put them in your routes, but you can put them in all sorts of different places in Laravel. But I mean, like I said, it gets to a point where it just gets messy, right? And we don't want that. So for to organize my code, I don't like to use closures a whole lot. I'd rather use a class and call it directly. I don't want to put something in my global or my routes or so on and so forth, where I'm just have these, just massive amounts of event listener closures all over the place. It just gets messy, right? We want to have something namespaced and loaded, and I want to be able to reference just the listener and associate it with the class, so that I can go into my class and I can do everything I need to there. And I'll get to that here in a moment. So really, it's the same way that you would do routes, for instance, right? The way that you call the methods or the class itself or the methods of the class. So you would have your user handler here, and if you wanted a method, you use the @ sign and then the method you wanted to use, for instance, like on update, on create, however you want to handle like a user instance. You know what I mean? So let's go. Also, in this case, in your classes, Laravel has the handle function, which basically picks up automatically. So if you have just this class, user handle, and all you have is just a class and with a one method named handle, that's where you can like send your email, for instance, if you want to send an email for a user. So handle is basically what gets called directly, inherently rather. So here's an example, for instance. So the handle method is called automatically. So when you set up that class, just you can toss it anywhere. I mean, if you have it outside of the app, whatever, you can namespace it, do whatever you want. But so when you call the user itself, you want to specify a method, you can do handle directly. But if you have multiple methods that you want to reference, like on user handler, we can take a look at that. So basically, we have these. Sorry. So yeah, so if you want to reference just a method in there instead of using the handle inherent method, you just make your own methods and you call it like you would any other item, the @ sign, and then the method itself. Nothing crazy. But now we're gonna go into subscribers. This is a little more complicated, but not really. So basically, when you want to have an event subscriber, you make your own classes, for instance, right? Let's say I want to have a handler subscribers folder in my app path. I put all my classes in there that I don't want to use. And from there, I basically have my events that I'd like to use, like on create, on update, so on and so forth. And then when you subscribe your events, you have the subscribe function that it picks up automatically. And then it calls you check, actually grab the listeners themselves through the actual subscribe method. So it's inherently basically set up to do so, just like the handle back here. Make sense? Odyssey container, we're all clear? Yep. Okay, good. So then it's just easy enough as calling the user event subscriber. So instead of firing and listening, you're subscribed at all times. So basically all your events are ready to go whenever you want them. And it's nice and clean. So now it gets more of the, where do I put stuff, right? The big question of Laravel documentation. So one of the easiest ways to set this up is just to add your listeners into the app directory and make a file called observers.php. Name whatever you want, it doesn't matter. And you can go with global.php file and basically just require app path to put the observers in there. And you're done. And just do a composer dump and your money. Nothing crazy. So remember, it's just PHP. You can always add your handlers anywhere. The easiest way to namespace them is within a new folder, an app, for instance. And register your subscribers in global.php. So you have the event subscription, it's a bad typo, subscript. You basically just use event subscription. Like, so you have your handlers in the app folder, right? So you have a namespace. And then you just register user events. So I mean, there's lots of stuff in global.php. You have your, so on and so forth. Just make a new section in there. That's where you can subscribe and register all your subscribers or your handlers, and they're very easy to set up. And once you do that, just put PSR0 to composer dump, and make sure once you do that, you actually have to use full namespaces You can't just use direct facades. So that's it.
Sweet.
It's very. That's all I did about 2 hours ago. So. It was nice and quick. Is there any questions?
I still want to know why that second parameter needs to be an array.
It probably doesn't have to be, but I mean,
Like the event method or the event class like wants it to be an array. Is it like built into the?
you might be able to do both. I've always just used
like
arrays.
we're supposed to be passing in the second parameter to the array or something.
But I think of it like the second parameter for like a view, right? If you're passing in data to the view, it's pretty much always an array, right?
Yeah.
Is it an array of arguments for the necessary maybe?
Yeah.
You can use any type of an array, you can even use an associative array so that you can pull out specific arguments on the listener side.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't, you can either pass in like just a direct object, an array, or an associative array. And if you use an associative array, then the variable names that you define as the keys in the associative array are what it does all that fancy like list and generating variables and just call user func.
But when you pass it as a straight object, you want to wrap it in an array.
You can if you want to. That's how it's documented. But I've just passed it in directly before, and it works all the same. Taylor put a lot of hand-holding magic behind the method call. So.
You did kind of touch on it there, but one thing that might maybe be drawing out a little bit is when you have listeners, even though you can place a listener anywhere in your application you want, you need to make sure it's somewhere that is actually loaded every time you hit the server. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why you had the hard load there. But if you're using auto loading, it needs to be somewhere that it will be loaded.
Correct. Yep. All right. Appreciate it, guys.
That was good.
Yeah, I was having a laugh with my stupid spelling. Down there. Sweet. All right, guys. So my presentation is about APIs, very cleverly called APIs in U because I'm really good at naming things. And my name is Hunter Strasic. You can find me on Twitter at @Strasic and pretty much anywhere else on the web using that same handle. Since I'm relatively new to the meetups and I think I only know a handful of you here, I like to kind of go into who the hell am I? Because I'm just some dude at the moment sitting up here. I was born and raised in Dallas-Fort Worth area, so I'm just kind of generalizing it since not many people know all the specific suburbs. I moved here back in 2010 for school, graduated this May, and stayed for work. And I mean, Austin's pretty cool, so how could I not stay? I work up here in the Capital Factory for a startup by the name of Basanti. Both Terry and I work for the company, and I played with Laravel 3 a long time ago, spent some time away from it, and once we hired Terry, he more or less kept pushing how awesome Laravel was, which had nothing to do with the fact he was writing a book about it. And sooner or later, I was like, okay, I'll take a look at it. And needless to say, CodeIgniter went bye-bye, Laravel 4 was in. So, that's how I'm here. So you might be wondering, or might not, what is an API? The basic definition of it is an application programming interface. It is what allows other developers to make programs to interface with either your various services. In the web world, it's basically just a massive collection of HTTP requests made with either XML or JSON. Yay, everyone loves JSON. for a while, it used to be very synonymous with web services. So if you remember SOAP and SOA, I'm sorry, but if you don't, then great, because you don't want to worry about it. And we've now kind of started moving towards a RESTful type API, which is a lot nicer and a lot cleaner and less XML. So yay. I hope none of you love XML because I'm going to hate on it a lot. So for this little talk series thing I'll be doing, when it comes to REST, I'm going to be going more of like a pragmatic REST and less like hardcore Restafarian type approach to it. And when I'm saying pragmatic, I'm thinking more, basically think from the outside in when either thinking of your own APIs or following along, or as Apogee, one of the various sources I use for this, likes to put it, think as a developer using your API would think. Like, what is going to make it as easy for them to use your API? Because if you're a very, very API-centered business, which a lot of people are becoming that way, if it's open to the public, your API is only as successful as easy it is for the developers to use it. If everyone has a hard time using it, then you're kind of going to be not doing too hot. So, without further ado, let's get started. The first topic on this is database seeding. I'm sure quite a few of you are very familiar with database seeding, but just for those of you that aren't familiar or may not know exactly why it's really helpful, I just kind of want to go over it real quick. Yay. So for the sake of this, I'm going to assume that we already have a database made because it will be here forever if we try to build a database during the talk. What database seeding allows you to do is when you're developing the API, actually seed the database with a bunch of dummy data, which is very helpful because then you can use that dummy data to run acceptance tests on the API to make sure you're getting what you're expecting back from endpoints. If you send in crap, it tells you don't do that, stop it. The one thing you absolutely do not want to do is copy your production data and use it as your dummy data, because that just opens up possibilities for lots of bad things to happen. Like, oh, I just ran all the production customer emails through my testing email script and just sent them a very, very cheeky and colorful language-filled email. I'll give you a hint of what happens when you do that, and it rhymes with the word mired. And so just don't do that. Once you see how useful database seeders are, hopefully the temptation to actually copy production data will be just gone. You may be wondering, but how do I use these? Well, or make these, not use. First off, I recommend you use Faker, which has a little side note. I'm going to put these up on Speaker Deck with Faker and various things linked so you can get to them faster. But Faker's basically better at bullshitting things than college students writing essays are. So instead of you actually having to think of and write the dummy data that your program or that your seeders use, Faker just gives you a ton of helpful methods of, oh, I need dummy emails, I need paragraphs of just lorem ipsum or BS addresses, etc., etc. It basically has everything there, and it's very, very extensible, so if you need to add something it doesn't have, just the documentations will guide you along the way. And apparently my dummy link here text is still there. Oops, I also may or may not have finished some of this a few hours ago. When you're approaching the seeders, the one thing you want to do is kind of break them down into logical groups. So you don't need one seeder for each table. If you have, say, users, and then you also need to generate things like their dummy auth tokens and their settings, you might as well just group all those together, since those other two items are very, very just tied to the users that you're seeding in. I used to take basically the one-to-one approach, and it made seeding things very, very challenging and difficult sometimes. So once I actually figured out, oh, I don't have to put all these as one-to-one, things got a lot easier for me. So here's an example of a seeder. I have an idea of actually having an application, an API we're going to build along with this talk, but I wasn't able to actually plan the database part yet for this, so I'm showing off a little bit of an excerpt from the user seeder that we use for Basanti. So here we have the faker, which is just creating the instance. I like the seed faker so that every time you seed the database, you're getting the same information over and over and over again. So if you have a user, Joe Smith, every time you seed, it's always going to be Joe Smith at this email, et cetera, just because I liked it that way. And for some of the ideas I have with acceptance tests, I want to make my life a little bit easier instead of having to do extra steps to carry like IDs and all that around. From here, we're just looping through, creating 30 users, and here's where the nice magic of Faker comes in, of just Faker first name, Faker last name. It just randomly generates, I don't know how, because I haven't actually dug into it myself, but you make the calls, boom, you've got your just random crap data. If you need things to be more random and yet unique, it has a nice little helper function of unique and then the attribute you're looking for. In our case, UUID and email need to be unique. And then from here, we're just toggling a few things back and forth to add a little bit more randomness to our randomly generated data so that not every user is exactly the same. In our case, sometimes we want the user to have a prefix of Mr., Mrs., Miss. Sometimes we do or do not want them to have the suffix of doctor, the third, junior, etc. Faker has this nice little date and time between function, so you just give it here the range of 50 years to 18 years ago, tell it what format you want, and now we've got birthdays, phone numbers, street addresses, and then zip code. They don't have a zip code specific generator, but the closest equivalent I found was just generate a random number with the length of 5, and basically the same thing as a zip code. It has a lot of other functions not shown here, like you can either get a sentence or sentences and pass in a number of how many sentences you want to get back. Same with paragraph or paragraphs. Faker is just really awesome at generating a bunch of BS data. So once you get the database seeded and you have your data to work with, now you need to start planning the endpoints of your API. This is where you start thinking, well, what does my API need? First off, depending on how your company works, you need to talk to the customers or the business because they're also the customer. One thing though is when you're talking to them, I'd recommend not bringing up endpoints because chances are they'll look at you like, huh? A what? With these endpoints, you basically just want to list all the actions or possible things that your API can do, which will give you a bit of a easier time of planning out everything. So for the idea that I had for the actual API app we'll be creating for this talk is actually possibly definitely my personal website's redesign, because I needed a reason to actually do it, and actually doing it for this talk seems like a good reason. So I came up with a few resources that we'd need for it, and the first one is users. Well, we all kind of know the typical actions you need to be able to do for a user's endpoint, which is CRUD. Nice little create, read, update, and delete on users, excuse me. We also need to be able to list our users, and then we have a couple of other possible resources under users. For example, image, which will be how you how you basically set the user's profile image. And then you also have the sub-resources for the user of posts and projects that belong to that user. And then from there, We also have the post and projects resources, as well as their various actions, CRUD once again, lists, but also the option that I put in parentheses to be able to filter that list. Maybe we only see posts by a certain category or from a certain author. And then comments as well for posts. One thing that I want to point out is at this stage of API planning, it's perfectly fine to kind of give yourself an idea like, okay, for the list endpoints, I want to be able to search and filter by these parameters, but anything more than that, I would say is too much for this step, because I mean, like, create and update are very, very like extensive, like tons of fields that would just take up a lot of time to actually list them. Like, okay, I need these fields for the create, these fields for update. At this point in the planning cycle, don't even worry about it. Just give yourself a nice little reminder of, okay, I need a list to be able to do, filter by these things, move on. And projects is unimaginably the same, filter on the list, and comments belonging to both posts and projects. The only resource that I don't have listed is comments itself, since they could have a list up here, but they would only have the actions of, I would say, update and delete, since there's really no point in listing every comment in the API without its actual parent, aka the post or the project the comment belongs to, and reading an individual comment by itself is never done. You usually see comments as in their list type format. So for the sake of saving space, and may or may not have forgotten, left it out on this screen. So now that we have a general idea of what exactly our endpoints are going to be, let's take a look at some endpoint theory. First off, get, or read in the CRUD world. We can get resources, which will list all the resources, get resources X, get the resource at X, XYZ, get the resources X, Y, and Z, or X, Y, X apparently, and get resources X, sub-resources Y. There's nothing wrong with this level of nesting. There's really not much wrong in the REST world, except for when it comes to error returning, which I'll come to the next time we meet. But I used to go this route with get resources X, sub-resources Y, and actually having a full set of possible actions. But the more and more I expanded on that idea, it just got to be even more and more difficult to actually maintain. So in this instance, instead of going to resources X, sub-resources Y, I would just go to the endpoint resources Y. So for example, users 5, post 7, I just go to post 7 to get that individual post data or work with it in a updating, deleting type sense. Speaking of the sub-resources, when it comes to sub-resources versus embedding, either of them is fine. Both is better, and we'll get back later in the talk. We'll actually see the actual examples of both of them, but basically you can either have users 7 post and get all the posts for users, or when you're getting user 7, you can embed all the posts, paginated preferably, into that actual response for the user. But we'll get more into that later on the talk. So for now, we're sticking there sub-resources. Auto-increment ID is bad, said somebody somewhere. This was the book that I'm using as a structure or kind of pathway for this talk is Build APIs You Don't Hate by Phil Sturgeon. And the one point that he hit on a lot is how auto-increment IDs in your API is generally a bad thing, because if, say, somebody reverse engineers the API and notices that everything's just auto-increment IDs, they can just build a script that just hits users 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 just down the list until he starts hitting 404s and start scraping tons and tons of data off your API. Now, theoretically, you would have rate limiting so that he couldn't get all 500,000 users in an hour through this technique, but I mean, we all know with determined enough people will work around that rate limiting. But if you use something like a UUID, it's very difficult for them to be able to write a script that just somehow iterates over the UUIDs to scrape the data off the API. You may be thinking, but Hunter, there's a list endpoint. Can you just use that and get the data all the same? Technically, yes, but it's a lot more involved than just having a for loop that plugs in the number one after another. Delete resources. Delete all the things, but do not ever really implement this endpoint unless there's a good reason for it, because I have yet to come across an instance where I need to be able to call delete/resources, which just deletes everything of that type of resource. Maybe of a sub-resource, say you have a post with multiple images belonging to it, maybe I would implement the endpoint of delete post ID images, and then that just wipes all the images from the post, but never something like delete post, because that has the potential to be absolutely catastrophic, and hey look, everything is gone. Delete resources X, more common, obviously delete the resource at X. Delete resources XYX, you might have noticed I may have copy and pasted the slide and changed get to delete. And get resources X, sub-resources Y. This is when the problem I was mentioning before of doing this level of nesting starts to get kind of weird and wonky, is making, like, abstracting the controllers and the methods and plugging the routes all together. It starts to get a little too much, at least for me, to keep in my head correctly, of passing the correct IDs from the URL route to the controller, and then the controller to the whatever, handling the logic. But just an example of all the sub-resources. As I said before, in this instance, it would be delete sub-resources Y. Post versus put. This in itself could be a talk by itself. Everyone always seems to fight about this, but long story short, who cares? Just make it consistent, whichever way you decide to approach it. Or as Sturgeon said in his book, generally speaking, put is used if you know the entire URL beforehand and the action is idempotent. Idempotent is a fancy word for can do it over and over again without causing different results. So, for example, the updating of a user's profile picture would be put, because every time you upload the image to the user, you get the different. Oh, no, not that one. There's a reason why he always put for it, but basically, it's for instances where. Lost my train of thought. There it went. Better example, if you're updating a user, you're always getting more or less the same user back. I mean, it might have the different I changed my first name from Bob to Joe because why not? Woo! You're still getting back a general user, and the general consensus is update is put. A lot of people make both function. Some prefer post. I started out with post because I went to the internet going, which one do I use? And everyone said post from what I read. And then a few months later, I read again and it's like, no, don't use post, use put because arbitrary reasons that don't exist. And it's a mess. But generally, just make it consistent. If the developer is expecting to do an update through a put on this endpoint, keep it put on all the similar endpoints. Don't just randomly change it to post because you woke up on the wrong side of the bed and felt like it, or whatever reason you want to pick. And last but not least, endpoint theory. Plural versus singular. I actually kind of fell into this trap at first and kicking myself still for falling into it, but I was new at this at the time. Main thing is consistency. Consistency is key. You may be tempted to do something like /users to list all the users, but I'm going to get a singular user, so /user/1. Well, what about the example of XYZ? Is that user 137 or users 137? It doesn't really grow too well. And then if you do a little switch off between plural and singular, you have the lovely English language throwing oddballs at you, like opportunity versus opportunities, the spelling and possibly the whole entire word changing sometimes. So just go with singular, or go with plural, as I screw myself up actually progressing the slide. Plural is generally the best way to go about it because it's the most consistent. Like, get users. Okay, I'm getting all the users. Get users 1. Okay, I'm getting the user 1. Get users 5, 7, 8. Getting those users. It just is more consistent all along the way. So next time I'm going to go over planning the actual connection of the endpoints to controller methods, and then from there we'll start looking into input-output theory, returning errors, and further down the line we'll actually start putting code behind this. If you were here last month, I kind of gave you all a preview of this up-and-coming big package in the Laravel community called Dingo API, which makes API building in Laravel super easy with built-in like versioning support and the different like response types, transforming of output, which I'll get into later in the talk, as well as OAuth, and various other security implementations, and just a bunch of other stuff. The idea is that by the end of this talk, we'll have built a full API with the help of the Dingo package, and hopefully y'all would have learned something of actually how to build and create an API with your other current services you're currently working with, or make improvements to the APIs your company already has. So next time things will be a little bit more prepared and cleaned up, and I promise there'll, I think, be more code next time. But does anybody have any questions?
Yes, sir. How would you use Faker to manage a pivot relationship?
Sorry.
How would you use Faker to manage a pivot relationship where you have, it was authors and posts, supposedly? How'd you use Faker to get this author is related to this post?
Oh, okay.
To, many to many.
In that case, I would do something with a seeder where, say you generate the users, and then whenever you have the post seeder, there's nothing wrong with you using like the eloquent models in the seeder. So, excuse me. You can either, there's multiple ways you can do it. You can either do like a for each loop on, say, user all or author all, and then as you generate the post, just inject the author ID from that user model. So it'd be in the array, or if you're using the eloquent creation technique, you're just assigning author underscore ID to user ID off the model. You could do various other things. You could build an array. You could do like user list ID, store that list, all the possible IDs of the user in an array, and then use various methods to just pull numbers out of that array randomly, so that you have a less linear creation of post for a user. It really comes down to whatever makes sense to you, really. There's nothing that is restricting you from using eloquent models in the seeder. So.
And we use, a couple of places we'll have, since you know beforehand how many posts you're going to have, the total number, that we have the DB class that instead of using Eloquent to create the stuff, we're actually inserting it with the DB class, and then just randomly picking, if we have 30 posts that we know, we randomly pick 1 to 30. then just put that in. That way,
Right. Like,
So-
for my example, thankfully Terry
I mean,
kicked some cobwebs out of my head. Right
Yeah,
now.
I mean, it could go either way. If you're doing a random number of posts, then using the eloquent models would probably be best, because that way that way you're always injecting a post that's there. But if you know exactly how many posts there are, how many users there are, you're using a set number, then
Yeah, what I was gonna say is like in the example seeder I showed, I had a for each loop that generated 30 users. So we know that in the database there's gonna be 30 users, and we can just do rand 1, 30, and then each time that for loop iterates and makes a post, it's just gonna give you a random number of between the range of users you know exist. But if you're doing random numbers of everything, so you never know exactly how many users you're gonna have seeded, that's when the things I mentioned before come in handy.
Cool, thanks.
Another nice little tip on seeders, which it seems really straightforward, but I honestly didn't really think about it, probably because I didn't mess with config files too much, is something, what's something that you could do is actually have per environment configurations for how many you want to seed. So for example, for the API we're building for Basanti, we discussed this and we changing up our seeders soon to where for development we only need 30 users. So we can just set in the configuration file 30 and then just do a config get blah blah and for loop over that amount of people. On staging, we're getting to the point where we need to actually have a more correct number of things seeded in our database. So dev environment or on homestead environment, it would only seed 30. On staging, we would seed 30,000. So if you want to be able to change how many you're seeding between environments, I'd look into using configurations. Obviously, you can just do an if app environment check as well, but less ifs and cleaner looking syntax if you just pull the value from a config file and mosey on your way. Any other questions? Complaints?
How do you create your endpoints? Do you use Artisan, or is that something that you define in the routes?
It's just what did you define in your routes. So one of the things that I'll hit on in the next talk actually is Laravel has this very handy route feature where you can just define route resource, tell it the say for example users. If you just do route resource users and then tell it the controller to use, it'll automatically generate the routes for list, read, update, and delete, because it's expecting certain controller methods on the controller you specify in resource. I use those quite extensively in version 1, but something that Sturgeon mentions, and I actually kind of see why, is when it comes to the API, I wouldn't necessarily use those handy resource like route declarations, just because if another developer comes on and he sees route get users ID and route put, route post, delete, etc., it's basically the developer's version of the documentation of what endpoints and what possible actions are there. If it's someone kind of not as familiar with Laravel and they see something like route resource users, they may not immediately know, oh, that means that you can get a list, get individual, update or create or delete certain things. So the auto magic stuff that Laravel provides is very handy, but when it comes to the route declaration, I would stick to just straight cut and dry get, post, put, delete options if you want to build core support, which some of us know is an absolute pain in the ass. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm new to Laravel, but my question, I recently just set up a resource and used the handy resource thing to kind of get it bootstrapped and just sort of fire it up.
Yeah.
And then I was reading about the data binding for a post or a put where you can actually have it deconstruct what's coming in and actually turn it into your eloquent model for you, like the binding stuff. You can't do that if you declare your route as a resource, right? Or at least I don't know, because it's that binding sort of seemed to link directly to the actual like.
I think you're right. I don't think you can.
Yeah, I think you can. So that was my question. I don't know. Is it just not in the documentation that you can? Because then it sort of forces you, if you actually want to use the higher level binding, then you can't actually use the more straightforward resource.
Yeah, I think the resource method, I think circumvents a lot of that binding. So it implements its own binding, so it takes that away from you.
Yeah, it obviously has its uses, or would be in the framework, and it's great for some, but I found it to be more or less helpful in building an API. Building an actual like application, like a blog or something, might be more useful to have a resource route declaration, but that's just my opinion. Use it if you want to. I think somebody else had a question. Well, then I'm gonna put these up on speaker deck after I clean up some of my typos and put the 2 book sources that I used, as well as links to everything, including my own stuff, because why not? Whenever I do, I'll post on the Meetup site, or let Terry post on wherever.
I'll link it on LaravelAustin.com too.
Sweet. And yeah, thanks for listening.
That Dingo, is it in packages yet?
Yes, it is.
And where is it, like at a releasable version, or is it still?
It is.
Pre-beta?
It's in 0.6.
Yeah.
It's ready to go. I already posted it on Meetup.com. So.
Yeah, Dingo's great. So far I'm loving it, albeit some of the changes between the pre 1.0 version kind of threw me for a loop at the first, but it's, for how young of a package it is, it's very, very stable, surprisingly.
So would you guys recommend actually specifying a version in Composer now just to keep that stable, so if it goes up to 0.7?
Yes.
Yeah, I would definitely do that, because
until you're ready to actually switch it manually and watch and see what breaks.
Yeah, we had a couple of instances of specifying dev master and then watching things explode on staging. So I would definitely recommend specifying version 6 and watch the repo. It's constantly getting updated.
You gonna test your APIs?
Yeah, kind of. Working on it. Shut up. We'll get to that in my talk.
Like full regression through Selenium or something?
No, not that much.
It's a research. You don't need Selenium.
It's fine.
It's getting updated a lot. Sturgeon himself actually has been pretty active on the package, which I kind of see Sturgeon as a big, like, knows what he's talking about with APIs.
He has that book out though, doesn't he?
Yeah, the book is the structure I'm using for the talk. I promise it's not just copy and paste, but I needed some sort of guideline for the direction I took this, so made sense. I even did a little PR to the package. It was really, really important. I brought the routes functionality back for the API Dingo routes, because how he registered routes doesn't show up in the usual artisan routes command. And I was like, oh yeah, that seems easy. And hey, pretty text comes on the screen now, and you can see all your routes basically. It's cool to me because it's like my second PR ever to get merged, but.
What does he say about like expansion? So if you grab a user, it may or may not have posts, or if it's a much more elaborate API, like the post may not have the comments. And I've seen some APIs where you can pass in like a parameter to it and it can expand certain elements of that.
Yeah, that's something that I was going to talk about later, but basically the syntax, it can be whatever, but I'm going to use what I'm familiar with. This little package called Fractal helps with something I'll be talking about next time, input-output theory, of changing how things look when they actually kick out to the user. But one of the things it brings is the ability to do the embedding of relationships or those sub-resources. So like what Wes is talking about is I can specify things that are always embedded onto the user response. So say I want, every time I get a user from my API, I always want to see his or her 5 recent posts and projects. If that user is new, that you'll see in the JSON response, blah, 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 post, and then it's just going to be an empty array. Whenever the posts are getting added, it'll show up, as well as giving you the option to pass in a parameter, say users, question mark, include equals. I also want to see, maybe I want to see more than the 5 most recent posts. So include post dot limit 25. Hit go, hit the resource, and you'll get back the same JSON response, just this time the post will be 25 posts instead of 5. I'm trying to, on the fly, come up with an example, but using something like Fractal, which gives you the ability to transform and embed data into your response, you just pass in a parameter of include or embed or whatever the hell you want to call it, of the resources you want embedded into that call. And when it finishes the request, that data will be there. And you can even paginate the sub resources. So you can have like 20 different sub resources embedded into your response, each with their own pagination to go through.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because we recently started working with our accounting software's API because they just released it.
Yeah.
And they don't have any of that layering in place. And so we had to grab all the customers and then a for each for all the invoices on those customers, and then a for each loop for all of the comments on each of those invoices. And we're like immediately hitting our API limit. And so I think if you're building like an API, not to have that nesting stuff in there it's not a good thing.
Yeah, the little backstory of kind of how I am where I am today, but the first time I actually worked with APIs and actually knew that I was working with an API was last year during South by Southwest EDU. This group called In Bloom hosted a hackathon, and they were just like an edutech company that basically built an API to better allow developers to create programs for like teachers in classrooms and schools. And I had so many learning, like, what the fuck is an OAuth? And like, I gotta go log in here and then go back to my application. And then I ran into the same issue where it was kind of a, like version 1 of the API. So just to build like the teacher's list of classrooms, and then I had to get the teacher, and then I had to take and get that, and then I have to build the URL to then get all of our classrooms to then populate the list on the side. And then when I clicked on the classroom and clicked on the students, I had to do another for loop to get all the students. I hit the same nesting problem, and at first I was like, God, this is crap. And then I made it work and got second place in the hackathon. I was like, yeah, who cares? Now I'm like, Jesus, that thing really was crap, but they made it better, so yay. And I'm gonna make sure that functionality has existed in our API, because God, that was terrible to work with.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I do a lot of API work, or API calling to products that have an API.
Yeah.
And most of the enterprise ones that I see, they're versioned. So you have like URL slash, api.url.com/v1 slash API call. So
you pretty much have to do that.
What is it?
Pretty much have to do that.
Yes.
Some use headers. They actually specify the version of the headers, so that way the servers can route you to a specific, like you can actually have different versions running on different servers.
Yeah, except header, right?
Yeah.
But Apogee, like in Teach Dog to Rest video, right? I mean, they specifically say you version out in the URL.
Yeah, it's the problem with API, the API development is that there's no like set standard or set correct way to do things. So Apogee, who's the really big one into APIs, says like put the version in the URL because it's what they like the most. But back to that slide I had between pragmatic REST versus being Rastafarian, technically by REST having API/v1/resource is technically not REST because of reasons I can't remember, because whatever. So version 1 of our API, personally at Basanti, was under api.basanti.com/v1. Now that Dingo's built-in versioning technique is through the accept header, I just moved it to that because I liked it better, and it just kept it always, like no matter what, If I went to api.basante.com/users, I was getting users. By default, I was getting this version of users, and then if I wanted a different version of the users, I just specified in the header and was on my way. It's, once again, it's one of those things where pick whatever way works for you. Twilio does it really weird, albeit they have a really good API. Their version is the URL actually has a date in the URL, and depending on the date that either you pass in or you have to pass in a certain date, I can't remember, I haven't used their API, is the version of the API you're going to get.
It's the date they release the build.
Right, so yeah, it's like if they release
version number.
Yeah, so if they release a build today and then don't release another one until like December, you could be in December hitting URL of 2014 6. What the fuck is today? 10.
It's filthy.
And it works. They have a really good API and developers love using it, but it's just really whatever makes sense to you and works and is, please, well documented. So there's really no correct way to do it.
So, question again on Laravel and the extent that it has stuff for RESTful resources and Heteros. Does it have that? Or any kind of for auto generation of that? Because that talks about the problems that you had too, where you were saying, oh, I had to loop through and create a URL to get the users, and you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Have to, if it's well advanced, it should have a Heteros, and you just call that.
Technically, the API I was using was Heteos or Helios, however the fuck you pronounce it. And I think I did use those URLs with some. I was stupid last year when I was working with that thing. I wasn't even using a framework. I did like procedural like WordPress, looking a little cleaner than WordPress code. Laravel out of the box does not, and technically Fractal out of the box doesn't either. It's a feature that's been on the to-do list of Fractal since the package got created. It hasn't been done yet, but so far, as he's been writing the book, he's been working on Fractal, and his examples have kind of showed the new updates to Fractal the further along you get into the book. And the very first example, he kind of started putting functionality to the transformer. I think he was kind of just testing out structure, and then he finally just landed on, basically in Fractal, you're just defining an array, associative array of how you want the JSON to look. He just put on there the key links, and then an array of arrays of rel, self, URI, basically users / ID, or in the example of Basante, UUID. And that's basically how you do it right now through Fractal. I believe sooner or later the plan is to kind of expand it into automatically generating that Helios stuff, but a long time ago I thought about trying to pull request it and implement it, and I couldn't even think of how the hell to implement that off the bat. So at the moment it's one of those things you have to do it manually. But if you do it correctly, all you have to do is do it once through the transformers, and then you just go.
I just want to add to what Ransom was asking about embeddables and sub-embeddables. If you want to see an API that really handles that really well, check out the Facebook Graph API. They handle that really amazing. Like you can request a resource and you'll get a set of data back, but then you can I think they do like question mark fields equals, and you can request all of these fields, and then you can pass in a limit for each. So like you can get the user and then get the list of friends that user has. You can add limits to that and then do sub-embeddables of like, I want to get this current user, get their friends, but then I also want to include the birthday for each of those, that user's friends. So that, I think they serve a really good example.
Yeah, Facebook does.
Look at that.
Facebook does that really well, or the technical name of it is partials really well. Like the ability to, in their API, you could pretty much, like, expanding on this, you could go, I'm me, and I want my first friends list limited to the first 100 friends, but I only want, for whatever reason, their ID, their gender, I don't want their name, and where they're from, because I can, so why not? They have a really ridiculous API, and they do some things good and some things bad. I mean, I think we've all
That's
seen.
the one good thing they do.
Yeah, that's one of the good things they do. They have a few things that do badly,
Which
like
APIs are you talking about?
the versioning of Graph. They kind of screwed a lot of people over.
They don't version because they're Facebook. They just break stuff and go, oh, we broke it, sorry.
Yeah, Facebook was something interesting where they don't really version, like they put on the documentation, here's version 1, here's version 2, but to the developers they send out an email like 6 months in advance going, by the way, in 6 months we're gonna screw you over and deprecate version 1 and default is version 2. So if you don't update your crap, don't care, sucks to suck. And that's the extent of the email. It's like, cool, let me, okay, time to update.
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about the parcels, you called it. I kind of work with the Facebook API a little bit, and I thought you had to use JSON, like you did gets and you put in like nothing but JSON, right? Like you're not hitting an API endpoint. You go to an endpoint, but then you're sending in straight JSON, right?
That might have been their old version. They had a lot of weird stuff.
Yeah,
I've never seen
their new API is like pretty badass.
The only API I've actually looked at extensively for Facebook was when they introduced the Graph API.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. If you search on Google for the Facebook Graph Explorer, they have like a GUI that you can go and construct queries to like pull down data. It'll really show you like how to pull the data in that you really want.
Yeah,
just sort of Graph Explorer.
But are you hitting endpoints like what he's hitting here?
Yeah, you're hitting.
You actually like, but it's not like an HTTP query string at this point. Like you're doing more than just saying like user equals 1, friends equals 30, friends birthdays equals true.
Right.
You're not sending in that. You're actually like sending in JSON at that point, right?
No, all of those go inside the query string.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all
It gets
query
ridiculous.
parameters.
Like I've got some code that like I'm trying to like get pretty much everything, and it's it's like this long on my screen, and it bombs out their API because I'm trying to get a lot of data at one time. But
yeah, it's funny because Facebook basically invented their own query parameter language to specify all the things like friends.limit this.
I've actually seen Apogee sort of recommend that same sort of thing.
Apogee recommends basically a Facebook style, and then they just crap all over LinkedIn's style, but LinkedIn's API is just terrible. And then Fractal just recently, it has the functionality, it has the ability to parse the parameters, but I don't think there's actually like an official way to get to the data that was parsed. But it has a completely different from Facebook and really any other API I've seen syntax. So I'm assuming it's what Sturgeon implemented a capture where he works. But the more at first I was looking at, it, I was like, I want Facebook style, and then he pretty much was like, no. So the more I look at this new query parameter format, it looks a lot nicer.
I was supporting with the Facebook one is you don't have 50, 60 engineers to support how those things get turned into queries that actually pull and process this stuff. So it's like, it seems really nice, but to try to support that on your own would be.
Yeah, it's probably a lot easier when you have a graph database and not a MySQL.
That's what I do. I have native app developers who rely on my API, and sometimes you're just like, oh, can you just add this, this, and this, and all these? I want to get all this data in one request because they're lazy and they don't want to make a separate request. And I'm just like, no, sorry.
Oh yeah, that's the one thing that you'll learn really quickly is if you're building an API for your company and you like talk to the mobile devs that are also using that API internally. You'll find reasons to start hating those mobile apps pretty quickly when they start, can you do this? No, don't be lazy. Do the correct thing. Do it.
Within reason.
Yeah, and like, I'm on my phone. I can't make that many requests. And bandwidth.
Yeah, I always hear bandwidth. I'm like, I'm doing stuff on the server already to help you with your bandwidth. Like, just make the request. You know how to I documented how to make the request. But no. So many times I wanted to smacker Android devs specifically because they like to break the API on a constant basis. So if you ever need a breaker, let me know. I know somebody that can break your crap pretty quickly. Yeah, well, hope you enjoyed. Hope it wasn't crap. Thank you.